Everyone, thank you for joining us today. Our speaker, Markus Sabadello, has been a leader in digital identity for many years, helping to create new technologies in this field. He has played an essential role in developing standards for decentralized identities, led groups in major digital identity foundations, and served on technical boards. He has also worked as an analyst and consultant at well-known places like Harvard, MIT, and the World Economic Forum. Markus founded Danube Tech, a leading company in decentralized identity technologies. It's a great honor to have him with us today. Please remember that this session will be recorded, so we will wait a few seconds if anyone wants to leave. So this is all from my side. So Markus, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I hope you can hear me and see my screen that I'm sharing. The honor is all mine, Jorge. Thanks for the invitation to an NGI talk, and thanks for the introduction. So yeah, like you said, I've been working for a long time on standardization on different technologies and ideas, specifically in the area of digital identity. For example, at World Wide Web Consortium, Decentralized Identity Foundation, and some other places. And at this time, I would also like to quickly take the opportunity to express my gratitude for some of the great funding programs that we have in the EU to support work on standardization, like Stand ICT, C-Blocks, and Blockstand, which have also been supporting my work for some time. And yes, I'm a founder of a company, a small startup in Vienna, Danube Tech, and we work on various digital identity technologies. And in this talk, I thought I would try something a little bit different, or talk about some new ideas. So this is not a talk about how a specific technology works, right? I'm not going to talk about how verifiable credentials work, or how wallets work, or how OpenID works in great detail. But I've had some thoughts in the last few years that have more to do with the ideas and the values and the worldviews behind different standards that are being developed in the digital identity community. And so I'd like to share some thoughts on that. And this is a bit experimental, right? So this is not a finished message or white paper or anything like that. So, but just sharing some things that have been going through my mind as in the last few years. I've been collaborating with a lot of people on a lot of different ideas in technical standards. And to start with that, the first few slides, I have a bit of history. So just to do an introduction of what I mean a little bit by worldviews and values in connection to standards. What I have here is a comparison of how OpenID has developed over time, right? OpenID is a very well-known and extremely successful technology, a set of standards for authentication, for logging in, for federation of digital identity. And it has evolved over time. It's pretty old, so a long time ago, the first versions of the OpenID specifications were published. And it's still very widely deployed and very useful. But we've seen, I think, at some point an interesting shift in how that protocol is, how that standard has evolved, and how it's being used. So what you see on the left side is what OpenID looked like almost 20 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago. The idea was that you had your own server, your own OpenID server, your own domain name that you could use to log into a website, right? So you see a website here where you type your OpenID identifier, and then it would redirect you to your own personal OpenID server, which is the source of your identity, which is what authenticates you. And then you get redirected back to a website where you're then logged in, right? So it was a replacement for username and password. It was an early form of user-centric identity where you have your own digital identity, your own place on the web. And you can choose yourself, and you can use that to log into websites. And over time, OpenID has evolved a lot into OpenID Connect and different profiles and so on. And it has, among other things, been used for very centralized identity providers, right? So all these protocols, log in with Facebook, log in with Google, log in with GitHub, Apple, and so on. These are still the same standard, more or less, right? An updated, newer, modern versions, but still more or less the same idea. But the values behind that and the topology and the way how it's being used is very different, because now suddenly you don't really have your own identity on the web anymore that you use to log in, but you're using a centralized provider, and based on that we have so I'm also showing these diagrams that I think a lot of people know already, but this shift towards centralization of the OpenID protocol in some of these deployments has to do a lot with all the discussions we've had about centralization on the internet, and ideas like mass surveillance, right? The surveillance economy, advertising, personal data as an economic resource. You're not the customer of Facebook, you're the product of Facebook. Data is the new oil. And all the discussions about social and political implications of having centralized identity, centralized data on the internet, and then we had emerging concepts such as SSI, right? Self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity. The idea that personal data, digital identity should not be controlled by Google or Facebook, but should be more under my own control, and I should have an independent existence online. And I think most of the people in the meeting know about this, but we've also used some strong terms, right, like digital slavery versus digital enlightenment. But what I'm trying to say with this is that at some point the community, digital identity community, realized that the technologies that we are building, the standards that we are building, often have certain built-in assumptions, built-in values. So that's why the topic of the talk here is technology is not neutral, right? At some point there was this realization that the way how we design standards, the way how we design protocols and data formats and so on, has potentially a link to the social and political and other impacts on surveillance, impact on democracy, privacy, and so on. In 2018, there was an interesting event, the Decentralized Web Summit, and one of the outcomes was a manifest or a report that said we need to bake our values into the code, right? And there were several other initiatives and events like Federated Web Summit, Federated Web Summit, Internet Identity Workshop, Rebooting the Web of Trust, and so on. And so there was a period after the Snowden revelations and the insights that we have problems with the surveillance economy and things like that. There was a period where a lot of new ideas emerged, new ideas for new technologies, new protocols, new data models that try to build in the values of decentralization, of individual control, of privacy, to build that into the technology itself, and to build an identity layer for the internet that has that makes identity work how it also works in the physical world, right? Where I am myself in control, or the source of my own independent existence. That the whole ideology of self-sovereign identity also started to have corresponding initiatives to build the appropriate technologies and standards for that. And so we saw things emerge such as ActivityPub, Solid, social link data, DPKI, decentralized public key infrastructure, DIDS, decentralized identifiers, right? There was the realization that in order to build decentralized digital identity, we need decentralized identifiers, which are a W3C standard now. And things like DID-auth, verifiable credentials, and so on. So that's a bit of history and background about this idea that technical standards and the values and the worldviews and the models of how we interact, and the models of human nature, how human nature and human interactions online, how that should work. There's a link between that and the standards and the technologies that are being built. I wonder if I should check the chat from time to time. Okay. I will check the chat every few slides or so. So if anybody has questions or thoughts directly on some of the things I'm talking about, feel free to in the public chat, and I'll try to maybe comment or address some of the feedback or input that you may have. Okay, so that so far was sort of a bit of history and background, what historically led me also to think about this a bit more, about this relationship between the technologies and the values and the social models and models of how human nature and how interactions should work. Now, moving a bit more to the present day. So what's going on today in decentralized identity and the digital wallet space? There are a lot of projects, a lot of initiatives. There's a lot of excitement about decentralized identity, about digital wallets. So the idea that as an individual, when I go online, I would have this digital version of a wallet where I can keep my identity credentials, and if I want to log in somewhere, if I want to prove that I'm over 18, if I want to prove that I have a driver's license or a digital diploma or my citizenship or something like that, right? Using my digital identity online, there's this powerful concept of wallets now that a lot of people and a lot of companies are working on, which has the promise that on one hand we would have more secure, more verifiable data, but at the same time also more control and more privacy, because we would not be dependent anymore on centralized identity providers like Facebook or Google, but instead we would have our own digital wallets. And of course, in the EU, there's also a lot of political support for that idea, with the new eIDAS 2 regulation and the EU digital wallets that are coming in the next few years. And if you want to hear more about that, by the way, the EU initiatives on digital wallets, I'll recommend the other NGI talk by Irene from Kataka, a friend and longtime collaborator, I would say, who's also done NGI Talk, and she has really explained in more detail how these EU digital wallets are going to work and what the advantages and the properties are, and so on. But if we look at the technical landscape, and there are also projects outside the EU, right? So in the United States, in Asia, in many parts of the world, there are initiatives on building a decentralized digital identity ecosystem and use cases. But if you look at the technologies, now what I have on the slide here, when you look at the technical standards that are being developed, then there's a very complex, at least in my opinion, there's a very complex landscape and set of standards or draft specifications, right? It's not always a final standard. Sometimes they're also work in progress technical specifications. So I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see that there's a long list of, and this is just a part of it. There are even more, but these are basically the technical building blocks, the data models, the protocols that can make such a digital wallet and that can make that happen, and that can make decentralized identity happen. But why are there so many of those, right? And even people who are experts in the field, even people who go to all the conferences and participate in a lot of working groups, don't. I think there's nobody who really understands the exact difference and how all of these relate to each other, right? Sometimes they compete and do the same thing, but are just different ways of doing the same thing. Sometimes they complement each other, sometimes they overlap, and it can be very difficult to understand how they fit together. But again, what I would like to explore a little bit is not so much the technical details, but to ask the question, why are there sometimes different ways of doing the same thing, right? So for example, in a digital wallet, you need you have these things called verifiable credentials, so that the digital versions of, let's say, a driver's license or a passport or something like that. And in order to put that into a digital wallet, you need a data format, how to express them, and you need a protocol for moving credentials around. And but there are different standards, right? Different proposals on how to do that. And so the question I would like to ask is, can these differences be explained just by technical features or even user usage related features, or like ease of use, or properties like privacy or security, or sometimes maybe the compatibility with what exists already, right? So sometimes there are existing infrastructures, existing technologies, and then it's easier to use something that already exists rather than to create something completely different. And sometimes one standard simply has more features than another one, or different features than another one. So there are definitely differences between these technologies that can be explained with by reasons such as the ones I listed here, right? Maybe one is easier to use, maybe one is has a better user experience, maybe one is has some cool new cryptographic features that the other one doesn't have. But I think in addition to that, there are also, again, sometimes certain values and worldviews and political assumptions and ideologies that influence a little bit of how certain technologies are created and how they evolve in certain ways. And in the next few slides, I have 3 examples. So I want to look at 3 competing or alternatives of standards that exist in the decentralized identity community that fulfill specific purposes, and I want to explore a little bit what are the ideas behind those. So we'll talk a little bit about technical features, but also about what assumptions and ideas may be behind them. Before I do that, let me check the chat again. Great political issue. Not sure if it's the right place for such a difficult political discussion. I agree, Emanuele, but it's like I said, it's a bit of an experimental talk, right? And some of it may be stupid or even a little bit provocative, but let's see. So I'm definitely interested in feedback afterwards. But now I will look at these 3 examples and share some thoughts about them. So the first one is DITCOM and OID for VC. What is that about? So these are protocols that can be used for exchanging credentials, exchanging verifiable credentials, right? If you have a digital wallet and you have credentials such as digital driver's license, digital diploma, something like that, you have that in your digital wallet. Now you need a way of first of all receiving them, so how a credential gets issued into your wallet, and then also how you can share it, how you can prove that you have a driver's license, for example. Then there needs to be a protocol for moving that data around. And in the last few years, there have been a number of proposals, and I picked out 2 of them, right? So one of them is DITCOM, and the other one is OID for VC. DITCOM has been developed as something completely new, right? It's a protocol. It's generic. It's transport agnostic. It can be used not only for digital identity but also for other applications, and it originates from some of the early self-sovereign identity projects, such as Sovereign, Hyperledger, Indy. OID for VC, so OpenID for verifiable credentials, on the other hand, is an evolution of OpenID Connect, which I already talked about in the beginning, which in turn has its roots a long time ago from OpenID and OAuth. So this is a very successful authentication protocol. It can be used to exchange data. It has been updated, basically. So a set of protocols known as OID for VC have been developed in order to enable digital wallets and the exchange of digital credentials. And OpenID Connect and other OpenID protocols are very widely deployed. So as a comparison, what's the difference? You could say that maybe DITCOM is new, is more powerful, but it's also more complex, right? Whereas OpenID for VC is simpler and easier to integrate because OpenID has been around for such a long time, and it's basically an updated or upgraded version of that. So that's often an argument or a simplified explanation that I've heard over the last few years, that this is simpler and easier to use than this one. But let's try to look behind those superficial comparisons and arguments a little bit. Let's see if there's a deeper explanation. And this is where my talk here gets a little bit experimental and maybe provocative, and maybe people disagree with some of that. If you look a little bit deeper at the technical details of DITCOM versus OpenID, and don't worry, I'm not going to go over these sequences and all of that in a lot of detail. But one difference is that in DITCOM, everything is symmetrical, right? In DITCOM, the way how the wallet holder and an issuer and a verifier and an organization or even a physical object, the way how everything is identified is using peer identifiers, using the same construct, and every message, every interaction that's being exchanged is very symmetrical. There's just something called the DITCOM message, and it's being exchanged between all the participants, no matter how they interact. If you receive a digital credential into your wallet, or if you present a digital credential then to someone, it's more or less the same flow, the same symmetric structure of messages being exchanged between participants that are all identified using in the same way, using a peer-to-peer identification and protocols. In OpenID, on the other hand, OpenID is based, or OpenID Connect, and also this OID for VC set of protocols is based on OAuth 2. In OAuth 2, you always have, in every interaction, you have some actor called a client, and you have an actor called a resource server and a resource owner. And if you build a digital wallet and you use OID for VC as a protocol, when a credential gets issued to you, then you have this asymmetry, right? You have the issuer, who is in OAuth terms, is a resource server, and you have the holder with a wallet, who is considered the client. And if you present the credential using a digital wallet, then you have a verifier who you want to show a credential to, which in the technical terms here is a client, and the holder is the resource server, or also known as the identity provider, or self-issued identity provider. So without going too much into detail what that means, but what I want to point out here is that here you always have this asymmetry, right? You have different technical terms for the participants in an interaction, and you have different ways how the participants are identified and also authenticate themselves. In OID for VC, you always have something called a client ID to identify, and a client secret to identify one part of the transaction, but not the other part of that transaction. You have proofs of possession, another technical construct that proves that you control a certain key, again, without going too much into detail, but you have different constructs on one side of the interaction than you have on the other side of the interaction. Whereas in the DITCOM design, it's fundamentally designed to be symmetrical and based on peer interactions. And that's kind of a point I'd like to make here, that the basic assumption in one of the protocols is the symmetry and the equality of the participants, whereas in the other one you have a built-in asymmetrical assumptions about the parties in the transaction. Technically speaking, in the end, it may not make much difference, right? In both cases, you can do all the credential exchange. Digital wallets can be built in both ways, and you have many other differences in terms of ease of use and privacy and maybe and so on. So this may not matter much in the end, but it's still an interesting fundamental design point that's different between the two. I left one slide then to sort of do a summary on the fly. So I would argue that to summarize that is designed for maybe egalitarian symmetric interactions and relationships, whereas OID for VC is based on OAuth 2 with asymmetrical roles such as clients, resource servers, and so on. And technical constructs for identifying and proving, identifying participants and authentication are different depending on different for each side of an interaction. So something like that. Let me see if there are any thoughts. Okay, I see some great comments. I'll just quickly read that before moving on to the next thing. Yeah, adoption depends on users, of course, and it's about value. Right, so I'm talking about, or I'm trying to talk about built-in values inherent in the technology itself, but of course none of that matters if there's not value in the end for users. Right, so I agree with that comment, and that did comment more suited for organization to organization interactions, and may not work so well for individual to organization. I agree with that too. That's also a great comment. Yeah, so digital identity, of course, comes in different, can be done with individuals, with organizations, and with things. And I agree that if as individuals we interact with each other, then that may be different than individual interacting with an organization. There's clearly a difference in the real world of how we interact with each other and how we interact, for example, with the government. So that might also reflect then on the technologies that can be used. I think that's some interesting thought. So maybe if there is asymmetry, social or asymmetry in terms of real life relationships, then maybe that also more justifies asymmetrical technical realization. Very interesting. So I'll move on to the next example. This is about data formats. So in digital wallets, when we build use cases and applications and so on, where we have verifiable credentials, again, such as digital diplomas, driver's licenses, personal identification cards, birth certificate, and so on. We also need a data format, right? So we need a way how that data gets expressed in a JSON object or in some kind of data model and data format to be able to store that data and some data that we can move around. And in this case, I also picked two technologies that are both quite successful, I think, in the community. One is the W3C verifiable credential data model, and the other one is SDJOT VC. And there are also more. I know there's also ISO mobile driver's license and ACDCs and ANONCREDs and so on. But I tried to pick these two, and again, I tried to make a superficial comparison and then look a little bit behind what's behind them. First of all, the W3C verifiable credential data model, that's based on something called JSON LD, which as an underlying data model assumes a graph of data, right? So it's not like a relational database, so it's not a simple structure like key value pairs, but it's on the low level of this technology. There's a graph of triples and quads with subjects and predicates and objects, and that's then serialized in a JSON format known as JSON LD. And so behind that, the roots of that technology go back all the way to the semantic web, linked data, which is this older idea of having of the web not just being a web of documents, but a web of data where data is distributed in different parts of the web, and where data can be linked between different servers and different sources. And so it has this model where, or this underlying model where data is not just a single file with some keys and values, but it's really a graph of data that can be potentially very distributed. And so it's more complex, right? And it's designed to use something called data integrity proofs. So if you want, if that piece of data is signed, if there's a digital signature on it, which is very important for digital credentials, there's always a signature on that, then it's relatively complex to technically to put a signature on a graph. It needs to be serialized or canonicalized, or this should say canonicalization. But anyway, it's a data model that's not so trivial. Whereas on the other hand, SDJOT is a relatively, well, it's a newer than the other one that's based directly on something called JOT, JSON Web Token, which, similar to OpenID and OpenID Connect, has been used for a long time. It's been very mature. It's very widely deployed. There are many mature implementations, and the data model is much simpler because it's just a JSON object with some objects and arrays and key value pairs, and it takes that, and on top of it adds features for selective disclosure, right, which is a good thing. So selective disclosure means that when you present that data to someone, you don't have to present the whole data, but you can just select a subset of data. And so there are many discussions. If you go to some of the digital identity conferences or join some working groups, you'll hear people, or you look at GitHub issues, you'll hear people talk about this, talk about the difference and what's the best format for credentials in a digital wallet. And maybe a simplified summary could be like this. Again, that this verifiable credential data model is more powerful, has more advanced features, but it's also harder to understand and harder to process. Some people would also say that this is more insecure because it's more complex. Let's see if there's anything in the chat. No, not right now. So this again is the quick summary and comparison, but again, let's try to look a little bit behind that, and that again is where it may become a bit provocative and experimental, what I'm saying. So here's a comparison of, on the left side, a digital credential that uses the W3C verifiable credential data model, and here on the right side is an example of a SDJOT verifiable credential. And again, without going too much into detail, one difference is that the terms you see here, the names and the types and this kind of the way how things are named, this is defined in what's called a context, and the context is a definition of the meaning of these terms. And in this data model, like I said, this goes back to the idea of a distributed semantic web. In this data model, the semantics, the meanings of these names are inherently designed to be decentralized. So when you have a piece of data like this, and it says that this is a university degree credential, then the meaning of that is not in some kind of central registry, but it's defined in a context which can be created by anyone, right? So in different countries, in different jurisdictions, in different industries and different use cases, you could have different meanings of this term, right? Also, for example, here name, right? What does name mean? Is name just the first name? Is it the full name? Is it a nickname? What does that really mean, right? So the meanings, the semantics of these things in this verifiable credential data model, because it is based on JSON LD, which in turn is based on a distributed graph model. The meanings here can also be decentralized, whereas here in SDJOT, which is based on JSON Web Token, you traditionally don't have that. You traditionally have central registries, right? So there's an actual registry by IANA, the Internet Authority on numbers and names. That there is a registry where you can go, and then you can see what does surname mean. How do you interpret that? So this is an interesting difference, and I have. Okay, now it gets really a bit provocative. I have two stories here regarding the semantics and where meaning comes from. On one hand, I have a picture here of Confucius, the Chinese statesman and philosopher, who at some point said, I was talking about the rectification of names. It is necessary to rectify names. What he meant by that is, in order to govern a large state like China, you need to, on one hand, be able to agree on the semantics of language, right, and what certain words mean, but also what certain names of places mean, for example, and names of certain administrative units. So if you don't know what something means, how do you define what is a town, what is a village, what is a border? How do you name certain things? If you don't have a way of agreeing on that, and if you don't have a way of establishing clear meaning and semantics, then it becomes very hard to build anything on top of that, to build an administrative or a political system or a functioning social structure, if you don't rectify the names that we're using to refer to things. And second story I have here is a book that I read a few years ago that I found fascinating. Der Weltensammler. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the English title is, but it's a book basically about the British explorer Sir Francis Burton, who went to India and Arabia and Africa in the old colonial times. And he described in that book, there's a description sometimes, in some parts of the book, there are descriptions of how colonies were established in the colonial times and how the empire, what methods and what strategies they had of establishing control and power in the countries that they conquered. There's an interesting sentence somewhere that says, or something like that. So I summarized. This is not a literal quote, but a summary of an idea that's in there. And it says something like, when they conquer a country, you first send the military and the soldiers, and you kill everyone. But then after that, the next thing you do is you send cartographers and linguists, and you change the names of the places, and you establish, try to promote your language and the concepts and certain meanings of your own culture, in order to basically take away parts of the identity of the people that you're conquering, right? So you say you rename certain things, you force a population to use certain terms and ideas and semantics in their language and in their social structures that they that they did not have before. So this may be a radical idea now and a radical thing that I'm saying when I was just talking about data formats of verifiable credentials, right? This may sound like a radical jump going from JSON-LD and SD-JOT to something like colonizing people, but I do think there is some potential power asymmetry also behind the idea of who controls semantics, right? So in the beginning, I was talking about self-sovereign identity and ideology and how we use the terms such as digital slavery if we use centralized Facebook login versus digital enlightenment if we have our own self-sovereign identity system, and that has mostly to do with the values of the data, right? My first name, my last name, my address, who has access to that, and so on. So how centralized or how decentralized is my actual data? But I think in addition to that, it can also matter how centralized or decentralized are the semantics, the meanings, not the values, not my date of birth, not my name, my actual name, or my religion or whatever, but also who controls the meanings of those, the semantics of those terms, such as what does a name mean, right? In some societies, this here, for example, right, name. In some societies, this may be the official name assigned to me by the state, but in some other societies, name may be something more that the community or my family uses for me, right? So even that, I think it's, if we want to build a truly decentralized digital identity system, then who establishes and who controls the semantics is also a potential source of power asymmetry and control. So let's see. I wonder if I offended or confused everyone by that. But if you have any thoughts on this, if you think this is completely stupid and doesn't make any sense, then I'd be also interested in hearing that. I'll just quickly try to summarize this, and then I'll move on to the third one, right? So I could say W3C VCDM is based on an open world data model where anyone can find semantics, whereas SD-JOT VC is typically dependent on centralized registries of meanings of terms. Asymmetry of semantics in digital identity could be a source of power inequality. Is a theory, experimental thought. All right. Different cultural backgrounds between concept of identities, your name versus son or daughter of. Need to think about this more. Yeah, I also need to think about this more. Okay. So yeah, feel free to keep posting or sharing some thoughts. I have one more example, and then after that I have 2 or 3 slides as a conclusion or summary. I think we have still a bit of time, right? This is scheduled for 1.5 hours, so I will go through that A third example of different, maybe competing standards and some thoughts of what can lie behind them, and then, like I said, have some 2 or 3 slides as conclusion. But yeah, feel free to share your thoughts on this. So the third one here is DIDS versus the CNF JOT claim, and I have to explain that also a little bit. This is about again, credentials in a wallet. Again, whatever, driver's license, visa, diploma, passport. When a digital credential goes into my wallet, it is bound to me, right? There are these terms such as holder binding or user binding or device binding. So there's something in the credential that says it's my credential and not your credential. So if I share it with someone, then they cannot impersonate me. Somebody else cannot present my driver's license because it's mine and not yours, right? And so for this binding to the holder, there are also different ways in the different working groups and initiatives on how to do that. One is with DIDs. So DIDs, I haven't talked about DIDs yet, right? But DIDs are identifiers, decentralized identifiers. It's an identifier for me, for a company, for a government, for a thing. So an identifier that is inherently decentralized, that is not assigned to me by some authority, but it's an identifier that is generated by me using my wallet on my own. And that identifier is in the credential, right? So the credential says it's about a certain DID. It's about a subject like me as a person who is identified by a DID. And so one way of binding, of expressing that a credential is my credential and not your credential, is by including my DID in the credential. Another way of binding a credential to the holder, to the subject who is described by the credential, is something called the CNF claim, which means confirmation. This has been part of the JSON Web Token data model also for a long time. And it's basically a public key, a cryptographic public key. The credential is bound to that public key, and then the idea is that my wallet and I'm in control of that key, right? So I can prove that this is my credential and not your credential because it has my public key in it. So the difference here is maybe that in the first case, the credential is bound to my DID, whereas in the second case, the credential is bound to my public key. And if you know about DIDs, and I don't want to go too much into detail, but if you know about DIDs, and there are also different types of DIDs, different so-called DID methods, and usually what's used here as a DID to which my credential is bound, often these DIDs are used, DID JWK or DID key, and which in turn are also basically just public keys, right? And DIDs can be resolved to public keys. So every time you have a DID, you also have associated public keys with that. So what you would often hear when you're part of discussions about these two alternatives, people will often say that there's not really a difference, right? Because this CNF claim, if you put that into a credential, it's my public key. Whereas if you put a DID into my credential, the DID can be resolved to my public key. And for certain DID methods like DID JWK or DID key, the DID itself is actually the public key. So there's no real difference. It's basically just a different encoding, right? This here is my public key, and this resolves or links to my public key, and both are essentially the same mechanism how you express that a credential is my credential and not your credential, because it's bound to my public key. There's a similar discussion also about how to identify not me, but the issuer of a credential. For that, the university or the bank or the government, somebody who gives a credential to me into my wallet, there's a similar discussion. You can also use DITs for that, or you can use something called JWT-VC issuer metadata. But again, you could say that it's more or less the same thing, because this is a way of putting the issuer's public keys on a web server, and with DITs, especially using a DIT web method, you also basically just put the issuer's public key on a web server. So people will often say that it's more or less the same, right? So I'm showing again the similar diagram as I've shown before, where you have an issuer and the holder with their wallet. And often you see implementations like this, where the holder has a DIT that is DIT JWK or DIT key, and the issuer has a DIT web. But you also see projects and architectures like this, where the holder uses this CNF claim, and the issuer has this thing called issuer metadata. And technically, it's almost the same, right? Like I said, here, the DIT is DIT JWK. The DIT is just my public key, and the CNF is also my public key on my device. And in this case, DIT web, you have the issuer's public key on a web server, and here in this case, you also have the issuer's public keys on a web server. But if we look at, and here's a technical example again. This is actually the same example as before with the verifiable credentials, but I'm highlighting something different here, right? You have here you have a DIT identifying the issuer and a DIT identifying the subject, and here you have a URL identifying the issuer and the public key for the subject. But again, it's basically the same thing. Here you have public keys in the credentials. Here you have public keys on a web server. Here you also have public keys in the credential, and here you also have public keys on a web server. So it's almost the same. But I think the difference from a ideological point of view, not technical, but the difference in how you look at it is the asymmetry again, right? So on the left side, if you use DITs, you use DITs for both sides. You use the DIT to identify the issue, and you use a DIT to identify the subject, the holder. Whereas here, you use basically different technical constructs. What that can mean in practice maybe is that in this case, it's much easier to use different types of DITs, different DIT methods. So DITs provide an abstraction layer, right? There's not just one way of using DITs. Some DITs use web servers, some DITs use blockchains, some DITs use distributed databases or centralized databases. So if you start with a design like here on the left side, you have more flexibility in terms of exchanging certain parts of the stack without having to change other things, right? You can more easily switch between different types of DITs and different ways of managing keys. Whereas here, even though at the moment it's technically the same, but in the future, if you want to change the binding or the control and the management of the keys, then here it's much harder, I would argue. Again, this is more the experimental and provocative part of the talk. And the other thing that's different is that if you look at this on the left side, it's much easier to reverse the roles, right? So if the entity that's now the issuer and the other entity that's now the holder, if you want to swap that, right? So now I want to be the issuer, and I want to issue something to a organization that used to be the issuer, but now I want to be the issuer, and I want that other organization, that other entity to be the holder. I want to change the roles. Then here on the left side, it's much more clear how that would work, because it's all just DIDs, right? You have the DID for the DIDs for the issuer, the verifier, the organizations, the individuals, the holders, the things, and so on. Whereas here, again, a little bit like in this OpenID protocol, you have different constructs depending on which side of the transaction you're on, and different ways of doing things. And at that point, I'll show the ideological thing again, because DIDs have been originally designed as a technical implementation of the self-sovereign identity ideology, right? So this ideology that identity is something that I control, and that's not given to me by a central authority, but something that has roots in myself as a human being. The idea of an independent existence, the idea that the step towards establishing an identity is something that I do just on my own. These are the values that this is the worldview, the self-sovereign ideology that is embedded, I would argue, into the DID technical standard. Here on the right side, this is a cute little creature from a children's book. It's called the Little I Am Me. This is a story for maybe 3 or 4 year old children as they discover that who they are and who they can be in their lives does not just depend on what their parents tell you, but that the children realize that they have that they can decide on their own who they want to be and who they are. So it's a funny children's story, but it all of this has the idea that the root of who I am as a human being is not something that is given to me and can be taken away from me, but that emerges from me by myself, and that's the self-sovereign identity ideology, and these are sort of a technical result of that. And so I think this again is experimental thought, but I think even though technically speaking, what you have on the left side and on the right side is not so different. It fulfills the same technical purpose, but this on the left side carries certain different assumptions and views of how identity should work in the digital world. Let me see if there are any comments. DID versus CNF. Should the main point be? Shouldn't the main point be whether the verifier needs or doesn't need to involve to contact the issuer in the verification process? No, I don't think so. I think it has nothing to do with that. So I think when interacting with the verifier, if you have a credential and you present it to a verifier, then the idea with digital wallets, the idea is always that the verifier does not have to contact the issuer, right? This is observability. Does the issuer know where you're using the credential? When you go to a bar and you buy alcohol, does the government know that you're presenting your age credential, your driver's license? And that is always the goal of digital wallets, that the verifier does not have to contact the issuer. So I think that's not different here in this case. Like I said, technically there's really not much difference, but I think the difference is a little bit in the equality and symmetry again here, and in this ideology that is reflected a little bit in the DIT standards. So I'll also again try on the fly to write a quick summary, and then we can move on to some conclusion. The technical construct express binding of a credential to a public key, and DITs are more than that. They carry with them the idea of independent existence and self-sovereign identity, using DITs for both for issuers, holders, and verifiers, leads to a symmetrical identifier architecture. There's also the concept of an identifier meta system. There are blog posts about that, how an identifier meta system is a very useful basis for decentralized identity and digital wallets. So that's it. I then have some slides, and now it gets really provocative, and I think some people may disagree with that a little bit. But now looking at the eUDI wallet, right, which is one of the leading, most promising projects around the world for establishing digital wallets for all people in the EU, based on the eIDAS regulation, and there's a lot of political support and funding and so on. If we look at these three examples that I gave, DITCOM or OID4VC, W3C VCDM or SD.VC, and DITS or CNF JOT-claim, we find that in the current, so this is all draft and in progress, right? This is not final, but in the current architecture reference framework, which is the draft specification for how the eUDI wallet will work, in all three cases, the choice is the second one. The choice is what I, in a provocative way, maybe have described as simpler and maybe less decentralized, less with the self-sovereign identity, less with the open world data model, less with this equality and symmetry. They have chosen this protocol, this data format, and this way of binding the credentials. So they are all three things that are here. And I know this can be argued and discussed, and people may not agree with that, but it's consistently, at least in my mind, the simpler choice and the one that's less decentralized or less symmetrical or less egalitarian, less with this SSI, self-sovereign identity ideology, and not the more complex ones. And then I thought, why is there this trade-off, right? So I wonder if there's a trade-off on one hand between simplicity and the more SSI, more decentralized. If you've been to some of the conferences last year, like Internet Identity Workshop and so on, you probably saw people with T-shirts that say "simple is a feature," right? And when I saw that simple is a feature, and these are people who I respect a lot, who do a lot of great work, and they've really done. They are advancing all the work, all the technologies for digital wallets, and so on. But the argument for certain technical choices is simplicity, right? For OpenID4VC, SD.VC, simplicity has been in the community has been a very important argument in the last 1 or 2 years, and also pragmatism, right? So pragmatic energy is another motto that we've seen a lot. So the argument is that let's build digital wallets and let's make them simple and let's do what's pragmatic. And I looked up pragmatism as a pursuit of practicality over aesthetic qualities and ideals. So building something that works, right? That works quickly. And I also looked up populism, right? In maybe somewhere outside the digital identity community, in general, European politics, populism is an important political mechanism that's maybe getting stronger in a lot of countries. Populism means to present overly simplistic answers to complex questions, right? So I wonder, and this is now maybe the most provocative, controversial thing I will say in this talk, I wonder if we could speak of something like standards pragmatism or even standards populism. If we see, going back one slide, if we see choices being made for things that are simpler, but less about decentralization, less about open world models, less about self-sovereign identity. And I know this is controversial, and I know this is a little bit provocative to come up with this concept of populism or standards populism or standards that are present overly simplistic answers at the expense of things that may matter at some point. And somehow this reminds me a little bit, going back to my very first slide now, sometimes this reminds me a little bit of what we've seen in the evolution of the OpenID protocol and the OpenID standards, where we started with this very idealistic user-centric model where anyone can bring their own identity to log in to websites. And then we ended up with login with Facebook, login with Google. And there's no doubt that this is simpler, right? The thing on the right side is much simpler. Centralization is simpler than having to really be in control of your own identity. And I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the eUDI wallet or wallets in general or some of the great standard work that we see, I'm not saying that this will lead to centralization and that this will lead to a new era of mass surveillance and things like that. I think what eUDI wallet and what all these standards are doing, it's all great. It's all really, they're all really good developments, but I do wonder a little bit about the choice of the simplest possible standards, and I do wonder about the values and the assumptions and the worldviews behind some of the choices that are being negotiated and discussed at the moment. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. I wonder if there are any more thoughts and comments. Wouldn't a truly self-sovereign identity system need all roles to be equal? Yes, absolutely. Impact the adoption of end users. Yes, of course. I mean, I agree. None of the technical or ideological discussions matter much if something is not usable in the end. Symmetric. Do I have plans to continue to work on this topic? Yes, absolutely. I mean, I said in the beginning that nobody can really, that there's no one who understands all the technical details and the relationships between all the standards. I myself work only on a subset of some of these topics. Like I work on DIDs and a little bit on verifiable credentials, but not really on OpenID. But I think it will continue to be a very interesting journey in the next few years to work on the standards. How are these relationships in the real world? Yes, I think I failed to really address that. Yeah, do we want to duplicate the relationships in the real world, or do we want to change them, right? So do we want to do we see maybe technical standards and protocols? Do we see that as not just as something that reflects the relationships and the social structures that we have, but do we also potentially see it as a tool for political activism, right? We want to change the world by making standards in a certain ways. Good question. I don't have the answer. I'm sorry. I don't know, Jorge, do we also want to open the microphone if anybody wants to share some thoughts, not just in chat?
I don't know if it's possible. Let me double check it. I'll be back in a sec.
Okay, then I'll keep reading the comments. In the meantime, I'll also put my email address here. I mean, I see some familiar names also in the chat. Nice of you, some of you to join, but also feel free. Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I was just saying I agree, right? SSI is easy as a marketing label, but more difficult to put into practice, and centralization scales better. Yeah, definitely.
Markus seems that it's not possible to enable the microphone for the guest after the event is started. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Well, yeah, basically finished. Again, here's also my contact, and be happy to look a bit more at the chat if there are any other thoughts, or otherwise that's what I had for today. And also thanks again to programs such as Stand ICT and the Block Stand projects and C Blocks. These are funding programs and also communities, for those of you who don't know that, where you can apply also for EU funding to work on standards and make standards the way we want them to be. Right?
Okay, Jorge is already answering to Philippe, so thanks, Markus, for the participation. And if there is no other question, I think we can close the session.
Okay, then yeah, thank you very much, and look forward to hearing from some of you maybe, and some people I know anyway, and I look forward to keep collaborating with you on various projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Markus.